I'd like to thank you all and welcome you now to our information session on noise-induced hearing loss, brought to you by SafeWork SA. My name is David Knight. I'm an Education and Engagement Advisor here at SafeWork, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. We're extremely lucky now that everyone's in the house to have a panel of experienced subject matter experts with us today and industry insiders. Together, they're going to talk us through some of the noise exposure, WHS regulations, and some industry best practices and some helpful ideas. And hopefully you'll get something out of that as we go throughout the session. We're going to hear from Return to Work as well to try to get a clearer picture of noise exposure, injury trends, claims, and statistics. Before we get started, I'd like to take the time to respectfully acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the lands in which we meet on today. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their ongoing culture and connection to the lands and waters of South Australia. So we'll meet our panel members in just a moment, but first a little context on why we're talking about noise. Occupational noise-induced hearing loss isn't something that we actually necessarily hear a lot about, pardon the pun. And I'm talking about in the news and other media. It doesn't have the shock value to make the headlines the same way that incidents involving serious physical injury or reckless workplace behaviours do. But despite not getting all the attention that it might well deserve, what we do know is that over 1 million Aussies are actually exposed to potentially hazardous noise in their workplace. We also know that it's long-term exposure that accounts for over 90% of deafness claims related to occupational hearing loss, and that it actually takes, on average, about 10 years for people to raise that as a claim and seek help. So today you're going to hear about the financial and physical case for protecting workers' hearing, and you also hear about what you're expected to be doing under South Australian work health and safety laws. We'll also unpack the regulations that govern noise exposure at work, and hopefully you will all leave here today with a sense of urgency to make a difference in the lives of South Australians in any workplace that you're involved in. So let's introduce the panel to you now. We have Heidi Turbill, team leader of the work environment team here at SafeWork SA. Welcome, Heidi. Thanks for being here. We also have Richard Kerry Clark, another SafeWork SA employee. Richard is an occupational hygienist and a chemical engineer in a past life. He's also from the work environment team. Thank you very much, Richard. Next up, we have Rob Byrne, who's a technical service lead at ReturnToWorkSA SA. Welcome, Rob, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, David.
We've also got Steve Clark joining us from steel manufacturer InfraBuild. Steve is the operations manager for the southern region. So thank you very much for coming and joining us today, Steve.
Thanks, David.
Now, just to get on a quick overview of what we'll be looking at in today's session. So we're going to ask you, our audience, first of all, what's important to you, why you're here, what are you hoping to get out of this session? Next up, we're going to hear from Rob Byrne from Return to Work, and he's going to talk about some of the current trends and injury statistics that are coming out of hearing loss claims. Then it will be over to Richard. He's going to step us through the relevant WHS obligations for employers, and he's going to talk about some of the key terms and definitions to do with noise exposure. Then we're going to hear from Steve Clark. He's going to talk about what InfraBuild's doing in their workplace to sort of minimise the impact of noise exposure on workers. Next up, after that, we're going to hear about SafeWork SA's proactive compliance campaign, and many of you may be here interested to know what are our inspectors doing, what are they looking for, and what are we seeing across the industry when it comes to noise-induced hearing loss. Finally, we will have some time for Q&A at the end, so hopefully all things going well, technically speaking, we will have an opportunity for you to chime in with questions at the end, perhaps using the chat function or the Q&A function at the top. So I would like to remind you about ways to participate today. We do want your feedback and questions, and there's a few slides in here which we're hoping to be able to use a QR code. We've had some technical difficulties, so we'll just ask that you use the chat function at those times. And the more that you participate and the more feedback you give us, I think the better the talking points will be and the better we can learn from each other on the topic. I'll just ask as well, when we do get to the Q&A stage, if you've posted the question much earlier in the session, it may be lost to the, it might be at the top of the list. So if you'd like to post the question again at the end of the session, it's more likely that we'll see those questions then. So with that, it's really enough of me, and now over to you, our audience, and see if we can get you involved. So if possible, would you be willing to share with us what you're hoping to get out of today's session? And you can use the chat function for this because we don't have the QR code abilities. But if you'd like to say anything in the chat, what are you most hoping to hear about today? What would you like our experts to cover? I might give you a half a minute here or so to type in some responses. So Tim's asked about current knowledge on noise compliance, and I think that will speak to what Heidi will speak to later around what are our inspectors seeing as part of their campaign. Yes, learning strategies to prevent hearing loss. So what can we actually do? What are the practical tips? Audiometric testing and exposure levels. Thanks for that. That's a really good point as well. Employer obligations. What help can be offered to employers if a claim is made? Wow, there's lots coming through. So I really do invite obviously everyone on the panel to scroll through the chat as well, and those who've joined us today. There's lots of great things coming through. What are the trends we are experiencing that are common, and what companies are doing about it? Strategies around how to manage a site when there is variable noise levels throughout, some not requiring protection. So that might be something that Richard might speak to as well. What about those variable sites where there's noisy areas and not so noisy areas, and what can we do to manage that? How to calculate the exposure levels, and the LEQ, which is to do with the over time. I believe Richard, he's going to talk a little bit about that. Thank you very much for those responses. It's excellent to see that level of involvement. I'm going to hand over now to Rob from Return to Work, who, excellent. It's you've already unmuted yourself. Thank you very much, Rob. I'll let you speak to your slide on statistics here. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, David, and thanks for the opportunity to come along today and present at the webinar. Just by way of a very quick introduction, so my name is Rob Byrne. I've been at Return to Work SA for about 18 years. And one of my current responsibilities is looking at the performance of noise-induced hearing loss claims in our scheme. So I thought I'd share some very simple statistics, and maybe some of this is sort of quite obvious, but for some of you, some of these statistics might be a bit of a surprise. I must say it's really pleasing to see in the chat all of the preventative questions that are coming out. If I'm going to be purely selfish, those preventative strategies will help minimise my work down the track at some point in time. So that's really pleasing to see. I thought I'd start off by talking a little bit about how many claims that we get through here at Return to Work SA. And I just really be clear, this is Return to Work SA claims, not claims that are coming from our self-insured employers. For benefit, self-insured employees make up about 1/3 of the scheme. So you might be able to sort of work out the numbers from there for self-insurers. So at the moment, we get about 170 claims per month coming through to our claims agents, GB and EML. That's about a 50-50 split that we get each month coming through. It does vary a little bit, but it's remarkably similar in terms of how many are coming through. Our challenge at the moment is the increase that we're seeing in the number of claims coming through the door. So as I've just said, 170 claims per month seems to be, well, it's the average for this financial year. It wasn't that long ago, and I'm talking sort of as recent as 2018, that the number of claims each month coming through was as low as 50 claims per month. So in the space of about 4 years, we've seen over a tripling of the number of claims that we receive each month. So that's a significant increase in no matter how you look at it. The age profile of the workers who lodge a claim, well, obviously it varies. We get claims from workers as young as in their 20s to as old as in their 80s. But what we're seeing at the moment is that the age is generally around 65 years of age, which coincides roughly with sort of retirement. That age is becoming a little bit younger as we go through each year. So it wasn't that sort of long ago at 67, 68, but we're certainly seeing 65. The key change there is not necessarily in the age, but the fact that someone is still in employment. For someone, what we're starting to see is that the rate of claims coming through where the worker's still in employment or close to retirement has increased quite significantly over the last few years. That's important because it changes the test that we have to apply to compensability for noise-induced hearing loss claims. So if you're within, or if you're still in employment or within 2 years of employment, the burden of proof is essentially on us to prove that hearing loss hasn't occurred in the workplace. If a worker lodges a claim, then after more than 2 years from retirement, either due to age or ill health, then the burden of proof changes and they actually have to demonstrate that the noise-induced hearing loss was caused by the employer that they've nominated. So in terms of the gender profile that we have, you can see there's a clear bias towards male workers, with only 5% of our population, claims population, being related to female workers. Just to give you an indication, that does change obviously from industry to industry. So for manufacturing, that's about 10% of their noise-induced hearing loss claims. And for accommodation and food services, that's about 30% of their claims. So just looking at the industry, I suppose, an occupational profile, I don't think there would be any sort of huge surprises there in terms of the types of workers that we see lodging claims. Certainly labourers, machine operators and drivers, and clerical administration assistants workers, make up a large proportion of the claims by occupation. We do see some odd ones in there, for example, in managers and sales workers. They're generally workers who over time have been exposed to noise in the workplace, either through different roles or, I think, relevant to perhaps one of the questions before, where there's a bit of a mix of environments across the workplace where there might be a manager or a salesperson or an admin person, but they spend a reasonable amount of time out in the noisy environment in the workplace. No surprising, I think the manufacturing and construction is making up the vast majority of claims for noise-induced hearing loss, with, for example, in the construction, about a third of those claims coming from the civil engineering businesses or heavy and civil engineering. In the manufacturing, people like metal fabricators and machine and equipment manufacturers, they're the type of occupations that are driving the claims coming out of those construction and manufacturing. Transport workers, probably no surprise, it's people who are drivers, forklift operators and so on, are I suppose the predominant occupations that are causing those types of noise-induced hearing loss claims to occur.
Thank you, Rob. I noticed there was a question which had a few people, I suppose, adding their weight to the question, and just around volume of claims. Would you happen to know whether there's a correlation between the volume of claims and third-party advertising for claim compensation. Did you notice that?
Yeah, look, I think that's part of it. I often say that, like I said, I've been in this game for quite a while. If you'd asked me perhaps who some of the providers of hearing services were 5 years ago, I might have struggled to name one or two. I can name quite a few. So I think advertising is part of it, but I think there's a general increased awareness in the community around the effects of noise on hearing. We've got an aging population. Sometimes I sit here and wonder about whether or not some of this might dry up, but unfortunately I think we've got an aging population. So I think I think third-party advertising is impacting on this, but I think also increased awareness and the aging population as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for addressing that and answering a question as we go along. I think that's fantastic. Stick around though, as I do dare say that there may be more questions at the end. And we appreciate you coming on today and sharing your insights with us, and also hanging around to maybe answer another question or two later on.
No worries. Thanks, David. Thanks,
Rob. I'm going to handball over to Richard now. And Richard, thank you for being here. We're going to talk about we're obviously talking about noise-induced hearing loss, but it's great to be able to talk to you, staff from the regulator, especially when we think about the viewpoint of employers. About obligations. So we're going to look now, I guess, at the regulations and those kinds of things. One of the main questions I have for you is, what's changed, if anything?
Okay. Thank you for asking me that question, David. What's changed? Nothing, in short. In essence, there are three work health and safety regulations that apply, and they sort of need to be read in a flowing way, a little bit like that diagram suggests, and it's regulations 56, 57 and 58. They flow from one another. So first of all, as we say, the actual workplace exposure limits haven't changed for quite a while. It's still 85 decibels over an 8-hour working day, and an absolute limit of 140 decibels as a single instantaneous crashing noise, if you like. And certainly this is an example. There are plenty of graphics that can be Googled. And just to add a little context, a typical quiet office hovers around 40, 50 decibels. Machinery like a jackhammer will operate at about 110. And a large jet taking off, that might not involve many workplaces, but the noise of that hits about 140 decibels. So don't be standing underneath a plane when it's taken off. But coming back to sort of some of Rob's statistics, I think it's perhaps a certain amount of complacency has crept into the working world. Certainly noise-induced hearing loss, it's not a lethal condition, but it is certainly prevalent, and it is linked to an increased incidence of, for example, workplace accidents. For example, hearing loss could impair somebody's ability to hear auditory alarms or bells, or perhaps even just being aware of things going on behind them. In addition,
that makes sense, yeah.
In addition, there is research that has shown that in workplaces where hearing protection is mandatory, about 20% of workers are still not using that mandated hearing protection. Our ears are a good warning system for things going on around us. So although the concept of noise is not new, we're still getting lots of ill health and accidents that are associated with it.
I might pop the regs back up here. We can look at these. Thanks. It sounds like there's a little bit of a level of lax attitudes maybe towards hearing loss, perhaps because it's not so immediately an imminent risk to danger or an imminent risk to our health at the moment or at the time that it's happening. I'm interested in the time-weighted average. It's something I don't really understand that thoroughly. Could you explain what the time-weighted average means and what, when the regulations say 85 decibels measured over an 8-hour time-weighted average, that's something that perhaps I think, if you could explain that a little bit to me, that would be helpful.
Oh, okay, yeah. The 8-hour time-weighted average concept is one that also applies to chemical exposure. But here, what it essentially means is that there can be occasional incursions that exceed 85, providing that the average over your 8 hours does not exceed 85. Also, what's important here is that we're talking about a personal noise dose. So noise levels from a single piece of noisy equipment can tail off quite quickly as you move a few meters away. So a detailed workplace assessment can actually start to get really quite involved. There is a noise code of practice produced by SafeWork Australia, but it's also one that we have branded up in SafeWork SA. And that it also explains that there are additional hazards posed by long shifts. So, for example, when a working day exceeds 10 hours, an extra decibel is added to the measured dose, and that increases for shifts that might be longer than 12 hours, for example. That's all in the code of practice.
Okay, and does it matter if the noise levels are just like a few decibels over?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So decibels are measured on a logarithmic scale.
Right.
Lovely, thank you. So a numerical increase of 3 decibels actually represents a doubling in noise dose. Okay, so how this translates, and if I can if you can focus your eyes on table 1, which is sort of in the middle of the page there. Okay, so if the exposure limit is 85 decibels for 8 hours, then 88 decibels over 4 hours also represents the limit. And 91 decibels for 2 hours is also the limit. And 94 decibels for 1 hour is also the limit. So going back to my point about long shifts, there's an additional potential for harm. Means that 84 decibels over 10 hours is now upgraded to 85 over 10 hours. So you've added 1 decibel. So that is an exceedance of the time weighted average.
Okay. Right. Okay. So I think I do follow you there. It seems like like you said, a doubling and therefore a halving of the exposure time from 85 up to 88, drops to 4 hours. That makes sense. Should someone be concerned if their working conditions look like they're not exceeding workplace limits? So if you're under the limit, is there no concern?
Okay. Yeah, and this sort of flicks back to those regs 56, 57, 58. There isn't regulatory action to be taken if the limits are not exceeded. However, as an individual, you might still have a concern. So all people are different, and there's pretty good evidence that hearing loss can still occur even when workplace exposures don't exceed 85 decibels for 8 hours. So, for example, the regulatory authorities in some countries recommend hearing protection at 80 decibels. And if you look at SafeWork Australia's guidance, that also states that hearing loss may still occur below 85 decibels. And so One of the reasons, as well as the fact that we're all different, is that our lifestyles also include other factors that could contribute to the overall lifetime noise burden. So things like using a noisy petrol-driven lawnmower. If you stick a sound meter near it, that will generate around 90 decibels. If you've got your music turned up nice and loud in your headphones, or if you like going to Taylor Swift, well, that was sort of concurrent when I wrote this, maybe Eurovision concerts. These are things that all contribute to your overall noise burden. Also, there are certain chemicals, some solvents such as toluene and styrene, and metals such as lead, that themselves cause hearing loss. And that can compound in a noisy environment to magnify the hearing loss, a process known as synergism. So the two things are adding together.
Right. Okay. Well, that's certainly something I wasn't aware of prior to the session. So it sounds like there's more to consider than just like a noisy environment, for example. With these things in mind, Richard, and considering that employers have a duty of care to manage the risks, what should employers actually be doing then? What, in a practical sense, what should employers be doing?
Okay, I think and now we're getting to the meat of the discussion. I think firstly, it's to assess the noise levels in your workplace, and one way that this can be done is, if you like, is a walkthrough kind of survey. Again, the noise code of practice has got a standard question set embedded sort of near the back of the document, and that's a good starting point to see whether or not you might have a problem. And that question set asks things like, can two people have a conversation standing a meter apart without raising their voices? Do workers go home feeling that the car radio's got to be turned up a little bit louder to hear it properly? Do workers frequently use power tools? So there's a whole range of questions there that are sort of little prompts for things that might flag up that you've got a problem. And that might be a trigger to call a specialist. And there are plenty of occupational hygienists that can do a more detailed workplace assessment. SafeWork SA's inspectors are not going to do this. We would expect the PCBU to act. So you've got to convince us that you're compliant. But the outcome of that workplace assessment could be something like a heat map. I've seen that a few times. It's a little bit like the Bureau of Meteorology producing a map of Australia on a hot day, and it highlights where there might be areas of high noise, and so with red and orange and green and so on. And at this point, so if you've got high levels of noise, we expect companies to apply the hierarchy of controls. Okay, and what we mean is, don't just reach for the earplugs, but think about smarter ways of reducing noise levels at a point source. I think we've got a little slide to that.
Yeah, we discussed this before, didn't we? And
okay,
I've seen these pictures. So these are options over and above just PPE, right?
Yeah. So it's a few very simple photographs. The one on the left there shows there's a noisy piece of equipment there on the floor, and what somebody has done is literally sort of build a wall around it, effectively a sound wall, and that's going to protect people on the other side from being exposed to the noise generated by that machine. The one in the middle, that shows something that's been encased again, and I would probably think that has got some sort of interlocking, so that when the door is opened, the machine cuts out, the noise level is eliminated. The one on the right is quite amusing, really, because rather than boxing off the machine, it's the people that have been boxed off. There's a little office area there in the middle of a noisy workshop, and that is what has been boxed off to protect people's hearing. So yeah, these are some of the sorts of things that the consultants are particularly good at designing, because every workplace is different.
I know you mentioned to me once before, Richard, about the novel idea of job rotation. That's an interesting thought. Maybe some people haven't thought of that either, rotating people out of noisier areas.
Okay. Well, yeah, these are some of the sort of engineering controls that can be introduced. I mean, I suppose, before that, I suppose, is whether people should think, can we get a quieter piece of machinery? Would be an even better thing. But if you can't do that, then case off the machinery or sound booths and such like. But job rotation is one of those things that we would call an administrative control. I'm not necessarily all that keen on that, because once the damage has been done, it can be irreversible. And finally, the last line of defence is PPE, and typically we think of the sponge earplugs or hearing defenders.
Yeah, I've got a few other pictures here I'd like to show, and I guess some of those other techniques you just mentioned, so we can reduce noise in other engineering ones.
Yeah, so there's a few. What this is demonstrating, and I've got a feeling that Steve might be speaking to something similar to this a little bit later. But things like so silencing flow noise. What that means is, so you've got pipes and ducts and so on that might be transferring liquids or gases, or sometimes they can get quite noisy. And so to look at the design and the shape of that, where you've got bends or the diameter of pipes, that can affect the noise that's coming from that, or simply where they're positioned in the workplace. Where you've got noise from air exhaust, if you've got fans that are put up around the workplace, think about how close people are to those sorts of things. The little picture at the top there, that's sort of showing a bunch of widgets crashing down onto metal plates. Again, sort of think about the design of some of those things, and is there a way in which the sound that's created by this clanging and crashing down, can you soften that in some way? Perhaps by using a rubber coating or some sort of buffer to avoid that metal to metal impact. Or simply reducing the height at which something is dropped. If your process involves lifting something and dropping it down, well, maybe don't have it fall so much. And the picture at the bottom there, what that is showing is how a vibrating piece of machinery has been engineered. It's been raised up a little bit, and a dampener has been put in place to reduce the amount of noise and vibration. So that's another solution. So be looking for the sources of noise and how you can reduce it at a point source. This is a little slide that again is speaking to that sort of the overall workplace assessment that an expert can contribute to, and so we have a workplace there. Look at where the source of noise is and where your people are, and how frequently or how long they're there. You could think about things like noise absorbing materials, sort of sound absorbing pads, that sort of thing. I've spoken already about partitions and closing off machinery. Putting noisy machinery in separate rooms. We do see that, plant rooms that are specifically created and warning signs that are outside that room to show that if you go in there, that's a high noise environment. Even just movable screens can be useful. If a piece of equipment is only used on a temporary basis, or from time to time, 20 minutes here, half an hour there, then maybe put in some screening for the time that is in use. So that's another sort of temporary quick fix, if you like. So it doesn't always have to be an expensive solution. Sometimes they can be cheap fixes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
No, thank you. I've seen those pictures before, and we briefly discussed them, but it's good to hear how, what they are in action. So if in this instance, you've gone through the hierarchy, and it appears that all the other things have been done, and it looks like you're going to end up still needing to use hearing needing PPE, needing hearing protection and earplugs and the like. What should you really be asking or requiring your workers to use?
Okay, I think there's a slide that follows on for this. Do you want to pick that up, David? Lovely.
Yep.
Thank you. So the picture on the left is sort of a little bit of a close-up of the typical label that you might see on a packet of earplugs. SLC80, what that is doing is telling you that when used correctly, this is designed to achieve a level of 80 decibels in your ear, so at least some degree of hearing protection. It says and it'll give you up to 27 decibels worth of sound reduction. This is Class 5, the highest level of protection. There are 5 classes within Australia, and that little table at the bottom there shows the 5 classes. The middle column there indicates the amount of sound protection that you might get from using that properly, and the little column on the right there sort of shows if you like, the maximum noise level to which that class would be effective. It would be tempting to always choose the highest level of protection, and I would say don't necessarily do that. You should try to match the class with the typical levels of noise that you might expect, because you can create other safety problems by, if you like, dulling out all of somebody's senses. So thinking back to the alarms and so on. So you don't want to cut everything out. People still need to be aware of what's going on around them. Is it another sort of shaggy dog story, if you like? Sometimes I've heard stories of people using foam plugs as well as hearing defenders, thinking that it will double the protection, and it doesn't. You might get an extra 5 decibels protection from that, but don't think that more is more. It isn't always the case, and it doesn't necessarily give you the hearing protection that you think. Importantly, when hearing protection is required, so this is your last line of defence, you've got to train the workers to use it properly, and keep evidence that they have been trained as well. We like to see evidence, and this is a lovely little slide.
You can't just hand out a bucket of earplug packets and say, here you go, you figure it out? Right.
Absolutely not. No. Because, well, anybody that's stuffed these things in their ear will know that you've got to put it in properly if it's going to work properly. And yeah, so this little picture here shows that there is a technique, and you sort of you're reaching over to stretch your earlobe out in order to put the earplug in properly. So people need to be educated and trained to do this properly if you're using these sorts of foam ear defenders. If you're using headphones like this, make sure that they are regularly inspected and maintained. I've seen all sorts of hearing defenders where all the rubber's all gone all manky and they're falling apart. So they've got to be in good condition to to maintain their functionality. And for example, there are many sets of earplugs, and if they're marked up as disposable, make sure that you do actually only use them once. Don't be tempted to reuse them, because they will not be doing their job properly.
Right. Yeah. So you know, after all this effort to protect workers and ourselves, how do employers then check to see that their control measures are actually working? How do you know you've done that, you've provided this, and how do you check?
Okay, well, this is sort of now drifting through the regs, if you like. You know, we've gone from 56 and 57, and here we are now on to Reg 58. And yeah, there is, and this is where you need to read it very carefully. There is a regulatory requirement to conduct audiometry, and we would say by a suitably qualified professional. And they'll do tests such as pure tone audiometry, and that looks at the hearing damage in each ear, and it checks it across. It checks your hearing across a range of frequencies as well, because hearing damage can be at let's say at a very high frequency, but your hearing might not necessarily be damaged at a low frequency. So it's a proper spectrum assessment. And again, we in SafeWork SA, we're not gifted to do that work. You do need a suitably qualified professional. Also, if you look closely at the regs there, so where there's a requirement to use PPE as your control measure, you must provide audiometric testing within 3 months of that worker starting work in a noisy environment, and at least every 2 years thereafter. So you need to make sure you've got that embedded, perhaps as part of an onboarding program, and keep records to prove it, because this is sort of where it comes back to ReturnToWorkSA SA's paper chase back to see what might have been the cause of somebody's hearing loss. I would point out that there is a subjective part to the way that regulation is written in the term frequently required, and there isn't actually any guidance on that. I would suggest that a cautious approach would be that if you're requiring your workers to use hearing protection, then do audiometry. But having said that, it is for PCBUs at this point to do their own risk assessment and kind of work out for themselves, what do we mean by that frequent exposure to noise.
Yeah, as you say, a little bit subjective in the terminology, a worker who is frequently required, but then much more stronger language in the legislation around if the PCBU provides PPE as a control measure, they must provide audiometry.
Yeah.
I suppose if you're looking at your safety management systems and you've noted as an employer that your workers are using ear defense as a PPE as a control measure for noise, you sort of fit that category, don't you? You're automatically falling into that category. If you're willing to put on your safety management system that you've provided PPE as a management for noise exposure, then you can assume you've fit into category.
I think that's the logical corollary to that. If you've got that as your policy, that's where it drives you.
Yes. Yep. Richard, thank you so much for sharing all of this knowledge and insight with us. We'll more than likely call on you again. I've seen a couple of comments in the chat. There's some good questions there, and I'm trying to take note of those as we go along. I'll more than likely call on you in about 10, 15 minutes time when we come back to you. So don't go anywhere. Don't run away from us just yet, as much as you might like to. Thank you, Richard. Steve, over to you. So thank you for joining us, Steve. Could you tell us a bit about your business and how you manage noise exposure?
Yep, absolutely. At InfraBuild, my part of the business is actually in steel distribution. So, we're taking product in from the mills, and it will be structural, tubular, merchant bar, and steel plate. About 70% of that comes in, and then we open it up, and that good photo there that you've got in front of you is of a pack that's been opened. And generally speaking, we pick orders and load them onto trucks and deliver them to customers. But 65% of our product is handled by magnets, which is what you can see there. And even though the guys are pretty talented, how they pick it up is they adjust the amount of voltage that's going through the magnets. And it's sort of a bit of a guess as to, if they're picking 3 there, how much voltage they need. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong, and if they get it wrong, they've got to reduce the amount of voltage going through, which causes one of those lengths to drop off, and that creates a really sharp sound. And Heidi knows, she's been to site a few times in a previous life, and they're random. So it's not like every 30 seconds there's a loud noise. It can be, you can get 4 very quickly close together and then not have anything for a couple of minutes, and then we get some really loud bangs again afterwards. And so not only have we got that, but we've also got 3 processing machines, a couple of saws, and a plate profiler. They also create a fair bit of noise when they're cutting steel. We've got beam lines that drill structural and miter cut and straight cut. We've got a plate line that does pretty much the same. It drills, plasma cuts, etches, all sorts of stuff. So they all create a fair bit of noise, and they hover around the 60 to 70 decibel range most of the time. Occasionally they peak a bit higher than that, but the way we combat that is when we go to buy a machine, we make sure that we take that into consideration. We want to know how much noise the machine's making. Exactly as Richard said before, we go and see if we can quieten that down, whether we put it in a box or put some baffles around it or put some noise dampening padding in there, those types of things.
So you use padding and use noise dampening padding in the workshop environment there?
Yes, absolutely. We had a machine that we've actually taken out now, which was a rumbler that we actually put rubber inside fundamentally it was to knock the sharp edges off of cut plate, and you'd load it up. It was like a big cement mixer effectively, and to reduce the noise we actually put rubber inside, and it didn't reduce the effect of the machine because the parts hitting against one another were taking the edges off. But instead of this loud continual clattering of material hitting an empty drum, the rubber really dampened that off. So it was a significant improvement. And as once again, as Richard mentioned before, when we have people start at InfraBuild, before they start, they all have hearing tests. It's part of their they're fit for work, and that's regardless of whether you're a warehouse-based or an office-based person. You always get your hearing test. The warehouse guys have audiometry testing every 12 months, and the office-based staff are biannually. So anytime a new person starts, or anytime there's a fall off, the person that does it minus 3 dB is the guy that we have come in. He brings his own van on site. It's really well done. It's all quietened down. You go into a booth and that sort of stuff, but he'll sit with you afterwards and go through, is it age related? Is it, have we got the PPE correct for you? And often it could be that the guy is just not wearing his PPE correctly. And that's a task that most managers have, is that, guys, they either don't want to wear the hearing protection, and they do by having it half hanging out of their ear, or you get the younger guys that want to use earbuds instead of hearing protection. And of course,
to listen to music.
Exactly. So if you're trying to avoid the sound of the warehouse by having music playing at really high levels, you're almost defeating the purpose of what you're really trying to achieve. So they're the sorts of things we do. And the other thing we get Trevor, from -3 dB to do is whenever we bring in a new machine, we get him to do a test of that machine at different levels and different distances so that we know exactly what we're dealing with. And then with that, that's when we pick the PPE.
Yeah, and that's interesting. What you mentioned about, you get the hearing tested at the start, and that -3 dB come in. Can I just ask? There's a great question on the chat as I was looking at that as I was listening to you, and kind of made me think about what I was wondering. Do you keep a baseline for those people that start and they're new to the company? They come in, they do that audiometric testing upon commencement. Whatever their hearing was at the time, do you keep a record of that as a baseline?
Yep, absolutely. And that baseline is then given to Trevor, and so then he's able to track, how your hearing is going every year. I mean, there's age-related hearing loss. I'm 61, so I've got a little bit of that happening, but I've also, been in the office for the last 15 years, and even though I'm in a box, Richard, I still often hear, loud noises, etc., which usually means something's dropped, and it makes me get up out of my chair and go and check to see what's going on. But absolutely, he tracks it. It's now digital. 10 years ago when I started here, it was all on cards and it was all nicely, little X's and that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's all digitally captured now. And Trevor sends a letter to every single person that he's tested, and lets them know, what's going on with their hearing.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. The other part of the question the person was asking was about software, and how are we storing? Is there any software on the market to store records? So it sounds like that sort of thing is provided at a consulting sort of level. Someone else can take care of that for you, and I'm sure it's probably something you could also import into a spreadsheet or whatever if you needed to within your own business. And once they provide a report.
Yeah, and the great thing about Trevor is he's actually gone back to the old card system and then plotted it all. So we've still got a really good record of what's happened. In the old days, if there was a hearing claim, we'd be digging through files and getting cards out and sending them in and that sort of stuff. But now it's all digital, so it's really good.
Yeah. So the long-term employees didn't miss out on a long-term digital footprint version.
Exactly. Yeah, spot on.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Stephen. For those who are wondering, the picture does show the magnet there. The sort of square shape between the two yellow columns there is actually the magnets are part of what looks like a much longer. It looks like there's maybe 2 or 3 or 4 magnets in one row.
Yep, there's 4 on that one.
4 on that one. They pick up the bars and so thank you for providing that imagery and the video. I took a still shot of it. I thought that might be the easiest way to have a look.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
It sounds like you've got some pretty robust safety systems in place there. Thank you for that. I guess you've probably covered this, but have you got any advice for other employers who are at the very beginning of their journey? They don't have anything in place yet. Where would you start?
One of the things actually I missed, David, was that part of their induction is we have a hearing, PPE module that they have to go through, and they're signed off on that. And every year we have another toolbox session at least where we talk about PPE and exactly what Richard said. Reaching over and grabbing your ear and putting the earplug in, the muffs and that sort of stuff. And it's horses for courses. Some guys don't like the plugs, some guys like the muffs, and we're happy to accommodate both of those, but they're also wearing a hard hat as well. So we certainly, I would recommend that there would be sessions out there, toolbox sessions out there for staff. Get your baseline straight off the bat from the pre-employment hearing. As Richard said, get your employees tested every year. That way you know what's going on with them. And if you're doing toolboxes and training, having a manager walk around and be diligent about how far that hearing protection is sticking out the ear, whether he's just got it in there for scenery sakes or whether he's actually using it to negate sound, is also a good thing as well. So they're the types of things that as you walk around, you know, you have to be diligent and make sure people are you know, complying to the rules, and it's there for their benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Thank you very much, Steve. I'll let you off the hook for a moment. We'll stick around. We might have a question for you coming up. Just by way of bringing everyone back into the conversation, please do share with us in the meeting chat if you've got any ideas or would like to share, or you're willing to share, what noise control measures are you currently using, or what have you seen in the workplace you're in, or, you know, have you seen in workplaces that you visited? Is it common to use? You know, are we all just reaching for PPE in noisy environments, or are you working somewhere that has, you know, a more diverse range of engineered controls? Are you using audio booths, you know, soundproof booths, or is equipment being placed in one area so you can say that's the noisy area? It's a really, I think, good opportunity for us to see what each other are doing and learn and listen to see what we're seeing out there. Someone's mentioning that Health Safety Environment Australia also conduct on-site testing. Blackwoods has an incredible range of PPE. Someone says it's earplugs where I am. How much do we rate PPE decibel ratings, i.e. earmuffs and earplugs? What's your take, Richard, on the rating of hearing protection? Do we place a lot of emphasis on it?
Yeah, thanks for that, David. Yeah, because that a question. I was reviewing some of the chat questions, and that was one that I had picked up on. Yeah, so how much do we rate PPE decibel ratings was the question. I think it's a similar thing here. As I showed in that slide, the PPE that you have should have a class label on it. So whether it's class 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So that applies to hearing defenders as well as packets of earplugs. And those that little label there tells you what the maximum protection that you get. So that class 5 there is giving you a maximum of 27 decibels. So that can be used at anything up to 107 decibels. In other words, that's knocking it down to 80. Yeah, 107 minus 27 equals 80. So that's what that little label is telling you. So look out for those little details on the packaging and well, somewhere within the details for when you're buying hearing protection. You should have that class data associated with your equipment.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks for picking that one up, David.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Do you think that the decibel ratings are, you know, are they highly accurate? Are these part of some standard that we agree upon in Australia?
Okay. Yeah. Again, there's a sanity check required here, because of course, you know, the values that you see printed on this are the maximum. You know, this is the best that you will get if it is used properly and if it's well maintained and all that. Yeah. So yeah, don't assume that it's going to give you 27 decibels. That's the most you'll get.
Excellent. Thank you for clearing that up. That's excellent. Well, this brings us to Heidi, who is our team leader of the work environment team. Heidi, thank you so much for being with us today. Working here as you do, I'm sure a lot of people have questions and would love to know what inspectors are getting up to and what is SafeWork doing in this space. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the campaign that SafeWork is running on noise-induced hearing loss.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having me along. Yeah, so I'll let you know we have been conducting a hazardous noise and reducing noise-induced hearing loss campaign here at SafeWork SA since February. And the main focus of that campaign is to go out to industry to conduct worksite visits, doing some compliance audits, and also educating both employers and workers around ways that they can manage noise exposure and obviously prevent hearing loss. So we will be looking at ways to try to raise awareness around the safe systems that employers can be using, and also share with them some of the additional resources that we've updated on our website that can give them some further guidance around the strategies that they can use to reduce noise exposure. Just referencing back to the statistics that Rob had quoted from ReturnToWorkSA, we are targeting those higher risk industries. So namely, we will be conducting visits to the construction industry, transport industries in particular, manufacturing, mining, and also commercial cleaners and lift servicing providers as well. The campaign here is running for 6 months, so it will be wrapping up in August, but we've already conducted a number of audits of companies to date. So I've reviewed some of those audits that have been completed and have got a little bit of a summary and some learnings that we can share with our audience here today. In terms of just knowing what to expect if an inspector is coming to your worksite, they will be certainly announcing their visits in making an appointment with you. However, inspectors have that ability that if they are attending your site in conjunction with another visit that they're doing for another matter, they may also do an audit as well. So with that, a PCBU would be obviously looking to review some of your evidence that you might have in gathering your data of doing your hazard identification on noise exposure in the work environment, maybe looking for some evidence from some records of doing the audiometry testing on workers, and if you've had perhaps a consultant or another provider coming out to your work site and doing dosimetry testing to look at the noise exposure that exists, we'd be looking for some evidence of that. Then an inspector would be looking to go on a little bit of a walkabout in, so it's a production area perhaps, and looking to sort of identify whether it would appear that, noise is a potential issue in those areas, and also obviously, I suppose, verifying that some of the systems that have been spoken about are actually in place. Obviously looking for signage, looking that staff are, wearing their PPE, looking at any of those other control measures that might be in place in the workplace itself. In terms of just giving an update, certainly we've had a number of PCBUs that have been showing that they're meeting the Work Health and Safety or exceeding the obligations of them under the Work Health and Safety Act and regulations. However, there have been notices that have been issued against employers as well, and I've just got a list of a few of those here in front of me now. So some of those ranged from just a failure to identify noise as a hazard in the work environment, in a sort of a noisy machine shop environment, not having done any type of hazard identification there. And also along with that, a failure to, even though noise might have been identified as a hazard, not having done any sort of formal monitoring to substantiate the degree to which it is an issue. I suppose that's really looking at that, doing a risk assessment itself. Then we had, I suppose, some notices that ranged from looking at an inability to implement effective control strategies, and that really spoke to a lot of considering some engineering controls that could be implemented to reduce the noise, but also in an absence of actually providing PPE itself. So where it has been identified. So some sites may have had evidence of having a consultant coming in and doing a noise assessment with a proper dosimetry piece of equipment, and then hadn't actually provided or had available PPE for staff to wear. In other circumstances, there were actually, well, they had PPE, but it was presented as an option for people to wear it. Where really what we're saying in a message is that if you've had that that proper noise assessment done and it is in exceedance, then there needs to be effective control measures put in place. And if you have no other means of controlling it but PPE, it is a requirement. Lastly on my list, I've just got a couple other things. Clearly just, enforcing workers to wear PPE in their work environments. I think we talk about that complacency effect, that people might maybe feel like it's interfering with their ability to communicate. And that comes back and speaks to that point that Richard was talking about beforehand around actually having the right level of hearing protection, because if you've got a level 5 earbud in your ear and you really only need a level 2 or 3, then it's quite probable that staff are not going to feel like they want to wear it, because they can't even talk and communicate with their co-workers, which is obviously going to be another barrier. So really getting people to review which hearing protection they're selecting and providing to their staff is appropriate. And I will make comment. I see that there have been a number of PCBUs who have, despite requiring the hearing protection of their staff, but they've not provided any evidence of doing the audiometric testing on their staff. So there have been a number of notices issued on that element there. So that's the campaign. It's running until August, and you would expect that you would get a phone call from one of our inspectors wanting to book in a visit. They're not doing these in an unannounced capacity in a general sense.
Great, thank you, Heidi. And just to clarify there, you were saying that there were some employers who, despite having recognised noise as a hazard in their workplace, made it not compulsory, made it optional for staff to then, use PPE, and that's clear that they've identified the noise and they need to provide manage, they need to manage those hazards.
Yeah, that's right. And even I was out at a site visit myself where, there was clear signage up all around in a particular sort of warehouse environment. PPE must be well worn at all times. And I didn't observe anybody wearing PPE. And in questioning it, it was like, oh, well, it's only if we're doing something really noisy. So we've gone back and said, well, if you prove to us that you don't need to be wearing the PPE if you've got this signage up around the place saying that you do. So so we really want to enforce and give employers the confidence that they should be enforcing staff to be wearing their PPE at a minimum.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate you sharing some of those statistics and what you're seeing in industry and what inspectors are seeing out there when they're conducting site visits and as part of the audit. Thank you very much. That brings us to sort of the end of the session, and there is a little bit of time here for some questions. There's been some great questions in the chat that I've noticed. I might. This is an interesting one that I think maybe we can all ask the question of, is there any guidance or suggestion in the environment that workers cannot use usual PPE, e.g. education sector? It's a sector that I came from, and I can tell you classrooms can get very, very loud. You don't mind, I guess I could jump in first here and say a couple of things. Individual employers have to take measures as far as is reasonably practicable, and what one employer or one school site thinks is practicable may not be the same as another, but it could be as much as having quiet time as part of the 8-hour period. But I know that being in a classroom can be an extremely noisy environment, and I suppose looking for ways to bring the noise level down. When you're dealing with people that are making the noise, it's really it's more of a people management issue rather than a noisy environment that can be controlled in other ways. It comes down to people management. I'm not sure if anyone else had any specific questions that they picked out of the chat that they'd like to ask, but there was an excellent question, Richard, which comes, or is that you with your hand up, Richard?
It certainly is. Yeah.
Has this got to do with chemicals by any chance?
Hi. Well, just sort of scrolling back, I'd looked at some of the comments that were made at the very beginning. You know, what were the sort of things that people were looking for to come out of this webinar, and I've also had a chance to quickly scroll through some of the comments in the chat space. Now, I think you'll make this point, David, but yeah, I mean, we will review all of those and try and get back to them, as many of them as possible, but we're just going to cherry pick a few. Higher level, one of the issues raised was people wanted some advice and guidance and on strategies to prevent hearing loss. Well, I hope that we've been able to speak to some of those things in terms of, you know, hierarchy of controls and the sort of things that people can do in a workplace. Employer obligations. Well, I think we've spoken to the regulatory obligations. There was what I thought was quite a valuable point about how to deal with variable noise levels. Because of course noise is not constant in any workplace. I didn't talk in detail about that, but one of the earlier slides, and certainly embedded within the code of practice, and there are links to that, the UK Health and Safety Executive has this thing that's called a noise ready reckoner. And that's a useful little tool for summing up the little parcels of noise that people are exposed to in a working day. So have a look out for that. The noise ready reckoner. That's a way of dealing with variable noise levels. One of the Q&As raised a point that is quite dear to my heart, and it was this question: is there guidance on chemical and noise synergy and how this impacts on the LEQ? The combination of noise and exposure is something that I've spent quite a lot of time on, and I wrote a scientific paper on this 25 years ago, and I'm updating it now. Within SafeWork Australia's workplace exposure limits, all of the substances that have exposure limits, styrene, toluene, trichloroethylene, lead, etc., they all have numerical 8-hour time-weighted averages, and some of them have 15-minute exposure limits that you have to comply to as the concentration of the chemical in air. Some of them have what's called a skin notation to indicate that impact on the skin might get into the body and affect toxicity that way, so there's an additional body burden. Some have sensitizer notations indicating that they're a skin sensitizer or a respiratory sensitizer. I noticed that recently there's been an introduction of a little symbol that denotes that that this is a chemical that produces what's called ototoxicity. So it impacts on hearing in combination with noise. So that's the little thing that you've got to look out for in the workplace exposure standards, is that notation for ototoxicity. As a regulator, the work that I've done in the past has shown that when companies are complying with the workplace noise standards, and when they're complying with the workplace occupation exposure standards for things like toluene and styrene, there is no evidence of synergism when you're complying with the exposure standards. However, if you have exceeded the exposure standard for a solvent such as styrene or toluene, or if you have exceeded the exposure standard for noise, then there is evidence of synergism. So that's the point. If you're complying with the exposure standards, no evidence of synergism, but if you're exceeding it, then there might well be an additional problem that you've got to look out for. The second part to that question was, can we quantify how that impacts on the LEQ? And the simple answer to that is no. We don't have, but winding back to what I was saying is, the first point is make sure that you comply with the exposure standards, and if you do that, you shouldn't have a problem with synergism. There was the final question that I picked up on, and again, a really important one, I think. How often should a noise survey, an environmental noise survey, be conducted in a workplace? I think early on in the talk, I spoke to doing that sort of walkthrough survey, if you like, as being your initial rough a roadmap to seeing whether you might have a problem or not, and that might trigger you to doing a more detailed exposure survey with an occupational hygienist wheeling out the dose meter and doing a proper detailed survey. How often do you need to do that? Well, if nothing has changed in your workplace, then it's reasonable to assume that those studies that you have done are entirely valid. So you need to do it when there are changes, quite simply. But particularly if you think you've introduced something that has changed things for the worse, or if you've changed the layout in some way. So yeah, there isn't an absolute, do this every year. We're definitely not saying that, but certainly if there are significant changes to the workplace, then that might trigger you to think, okay, we'd better have another look and see if something's changed. So those were some of the key Q&As that I picked up on.
Thank you, Richard. And I know that anytime I get an answer from someone who says, I don't know, I'd rather get it from a chemical engineer, or not I don't know, but there's no guidance on that matter. You'd prefer to hear that from a chemical engineer than someone who sort of shrugs their shoulders and says, I'm not sure. So I'm particularly pleased that you were able to provide that answer and not me or someone else. I've got a question for Rob here that was on the Q&A. If you're still with us there, Rob, from Return to Work. Someone says here, usually hearing loss occurs over a period of time. How often do you come across claims lodged by former employees who claim hearing loss after a few months or years?
So I suppose in terms of the prevalence, look, I don't have any statistics on hand in terms of sort of the frequency of that, but it certainly does occur, and it goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about when someone is lodging a claim for compensation, and so if they're within 2 years of either they're still in employment or within 2 years of retirement, either due to age or ill health, the Act creates a presumption that the whole of the loss occurs with the employer that they were last exposed to noise. So there's a presumption in the Act that says if you work in a workplace that's noisy, it's presumed that hearing loss has occurred as a result of that employment. And I think it also goes back to the question that was perhaps asked in the chat a little bit earlier, which was around how we attribute loss across employers. And that's a tough one because as that question sort of says, hearing loss generally doesn't sort of occur overnight. It's could be over 20 or 30 years of employment, and so without any proof to the contrary, because that's the defence, I suppose, of an employer to say, well, it couldn't have happened with me because I've got proof that there's no the workplace isn't noisy. It's almost impossible to attribute hearing loss across multiple employers. That's where I suppose those records of hearing audiometry or hearing tests that have been done in the workplace may support or otherwise the employer in showing that the workplace either isn't a noisy workplace or that the particular person hasn't experienced a worsening of their hearing during their period of employment.
Excellent. Thank you for clearing that up. That's an important part of the system, the way the system works. Richard, there was a question here which I'm not sure if you deliberately jumped past, and it may be the case, and if it doesn't make sense, then feel free to pass on this one. But someone talking about a compressed gas release, which could also create loud instant sound going over 80 decibels. And the next part, I'm not 100% clear on what they're asking, but it says a one-off incident would require an audiometric testing to establish base levels to monitor hearing deterioration, if any. I think that is meant to say, would a one-off incident trigger the need for audiometric testing to establish a base model, if any? And then the next part of it says, or it wouldn't be concerning as it occurred over a few seconds instead of the 8-hour sustained exposure.
Yeah, let's go back to the noise exposure standards. So yeah, your sort of short-term peak is 140. So if it's not exceeding that, right, then does it aggregate as less than 85 decibels over 8 hours? And in all likelihood, it probably doesn't. So those sorts of occasional bursts of noise, slamming doors or whatever, they might be quite noisy, but they're not 140 decibels. So and they're there's no way that they're going to take you beyond 85 decibels as 8-hour TWA. So in the regulatory sense, there's not a problem. On a personal, individual level, can it have impacted on your hearing? It might well have done. It might well have knocked out a few hair cells, and you're a fraction worse off for being exposed to that clashing noise. Would it be measurable as a decrement to your hearing loss? Probably not, but it's all part of the whole the soup of noise that you're exposed to in your life. With remembering that we've got contributors of noise from all sorts of other things that are outside the workplace in any case, that are going to be adding a little to the damage that's being accumulated in your lifetime.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Richard. A question here about the code of practice. Will it be reviewed to include the use of earbuds as hearing protection? My understanding is the code of practice doesn't specify earbuds versus defenders. It talks about hearing protection, and we talk about hearing protection as being of a certain level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I guess to answer that question, earbuds are already included as hearing protection is my understanding of it. Anyone on the panel agree, or not? If you agree with me, I think that's right, David. Yeah. And I'm not aware that SafeWork Australia is embarking on a review of that code of practice at this point in time. And I think maybe the last one, since we are running out of time, there's a question here on the requirement of an employer. So what is the requirement of an employer if someone's hearing is found to be affected? I'm not sure who would like to speak to that one. It might be a combination of perhaps Rob, or maybe even Steve, if you know what you've done in the past when an employee has been found to have a hearing issue, or what's the usual process if we think of it as an injury.
Maybe if I talk a little bit about from Return to Work's perspective. Certainly an employer could lodge a claim for compensation with the worker if they felt that the hearing loss was in their workplace. So ultimately, though, it's really up to the worker whether or not they wish to choose to lodge a claim for compensation. I think there was a question in the chat before about do hearing tests sort of, I think promote the lodgement of claims. Quite possible, in that someone becomes aware that they've got a hearing loss. They might want then to have a hearing aid provided or supplied as a result of that. So from a claims perspective, there's no obligation on the employer to lodge the claim unless the worker submits a claim, and so but there's nothing stopping them from being proactive in that space and working with the worker to lodge a claim.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rob. I suppose the requirement of the employer, this question could be read one of two ways. If an employee has begun the process of making a claim, I suppose then that changes the question to what's the requirement of the employer. So they may be asked to provide evidence of why the claim should or shouldn't be upheld. Is that what may be asked of the employer?
So what is the requirement of the employer if someone hearing is found to be affected? I sort of read that as you, as part of your testing, you've noted they've been impacted by the hearing. I would have thought the answer there would be to try and control that exposure, to avoid any future exposure and any future deterioration of the worker's hearing as a result of the employment.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rob. And certainly from our perspective here at SafeWork, we receive calls and people notifying us of concerns in workplaces where workplaces may be noisy, and workers contacting us to express concern that they don't feel that their hazards being controlled effectively. Maybe the PPE is not effective or not available all the time. And we do welcome people reporting their concerns to us in that matter as well. We've come to the very, very end of our time, I'm afraid, and I want to thank everyone from the panel. We've run a little bit over, but I think it was a worthwhile session that people get a lot out of. I'll just finish off by saying that we have a range of resources available directly from our website. One of those, which is the hazard identification checklist. Employers can download and use this while they're doing a walk around of their work area, and it should be done in consultation with your employees. You can see tips on the other side of that page there too, top 10 tips which came from Hearing Australia. Finally, I just want to direct everyone to check out our website at SafeWork, because we do have a hazardous noise and noise-induced hearing loss landing page, which has some top tips, links, and other resources. And finally, if you do require further information or you'd like to reach out to someone at SafeWork, please use either of the contact details on the screen now. Thank you for joining us today and for your participation. We hope you found the information useful and that you've got something you can take away from today. I'd like to especially thank all the panel members, Steve from InfraBuild, Rob from ReturnToWorkSA, Heidi and Richard from SafeWork SA. Thank you to all of you, our participants, for your participation. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being part of it today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Bye.